Hi students, and welcome to chapter 9 part 2. So this is the sustaining biodiversity, and mostly in this lecture we're going to talk about what we do to protect species. So a little bit more positive than the last one, but first we're going to start with some more reasons why species go extinct. All right, so let's start the list. It's kind of a long one. So first off, if you have a low reproductive rate, meaning, you only have like a few offspring during your lifetime, that's gonna, and then something endangers that, that can cause you to be extinction prone. Specialized feeding habits like the panda, they only eat like bamboo, so if that something happens to that like one food source, then you're in trouble. So again, think specialized species are gonna be more extinction prone. Feeding at a high trophic level, so your big predators, because they often need a lot of land and a lot of food in order to survive. Large size in general for all kinds of reasons, not just that they're going to need more land and more food to survive, but often they make for big targets for things like overexploitation, things like hunting, etc. Limited breeding area, like the green sea turtle. We love to live on coasts. Sea turtles lays their eggs along coastlines. And so if they only breed in that one area and then something happens to that one area, same thing. The spotted owl only will live in old growth forests. So if you're going to have a limited area like that, then it's going to leave you more at risk. And then finally, limited distribution. So if you only live in a small area, again, something happens to that area, it gets fragmented, wildfires, natural disasters, etc. It's not going to be good news. More extinction prone things. The birds, we talked about that one last lecture, but if you have a very fixed migratory pattern and you need to land in that particular wetland every year and then somebody bulldozes it and builds a housing development over it, there goes your migratory path. If you make humans angry, like you prey on their livestock, like wolves. Wolves were largely, they were driven extinct in the eastern half of the United States and nearly went extinct in the western half of the United States. If you don't have a big population size to begin with, so small island species, or not small species, but species that live on small islands, they can be rather extinction prone. And then if you have, if you're commercially valuable for some reason, so like the tusks of the horns of rhinos, the tusks of elephants. And then if you have behaviors that will contribute to extinction. Now, for example, birds often mate for life. And if one bird, and I've actually seen this in my backyard, and I have a cat, my neighbor has a cat, and one day there was a bird in obvious distress, and we kind of wonder what the cats might have done. But the Carolina parakeet flocks and hovers over an injured bird. That can then make the mate then also in danger of getting hunted. So this is an example from Ms. DeBruce. She's lucky enough to have been to the Galapagos, and she says that like the blue-footed booby, they just kind of leave their eggs. That just doesn't seem, but they evolved on an island where they didn't have any predators, so they didn't need to worry about it. But that would be kind of a behavior that would lead you to become extinct. Okay, so top consumers. I've kind of hinted and talked about this a little bit, but why are they going to be more vulnerable to extinction? Again, they have to be supported by the whole food chain up to their level. So when you think about the higher up you are on those trophic levels, the more everything beneath you has to be okay in order for you to survive. So past mass extinctions, you can think about it, also really haven't been kind to large animals like the dinosaurs. So nothing larger than a dog survived. And really what survived our last mass extinction were like the small rodents, etc. Okay, another reason why large animals can be more prone to extinction is the idea of bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So bioaccumulation was over your lifetime, you will accumulate toxins often in your fatty tissue. Biomagnification means that as you go up the food chain, as you see in that picture on the right, that you can get these toxins more and more concentrated because each orca has to eat an awful lot of salmon, and the salmon has to eat an awful lot of smaller fish. And if each one of those is carrying those toxins up the food chain, orcas themselves can have quite high levels of toxins in them. So we look at worldwide extinctions and realize, again, take these maps with a grain of salt because we didn't count for a long time species. So Europe, areas, areas that have been inhabited and populated and where cities have been for thousands of years, often their animals went extinct long before we ever started noticing. And so when you look at these like different colors about, you know, again, also notice that in a lot of areas, we just don't have the data. So one of the scary things as climate changes and these things move forward is that we may not know what's all the species that we have lost. So again, when you look at these maps, just realize that there's some caveats as far as how real are the numbers or how do you compare one continent to another continent. And again, this is just showing another one, extinct species versus critically endangered species. A lot of this comes from that IUCN again, but you can look at species that have gone extinct versus species that are critically endangered. And again, you know, the number in Europe looks really small for extinct, but I believe that part of that's because a lot of them probably went extinct a long time ago. Okay, so moving along, biodiversity hotspots. Normally you would be doing a project, and we're probably going to do some kind of composite project this year, but biodiversity hotspots are areas where we do still have a lot of biodiversity. So, and again, think about, remember that video we saw about tropical areas? A lot of these are in tropical areas because they have a high amount of biodiversity to begin with. But other things that make for biodiversity hotspots is areas that have been able to preserve that biodiversity because maybe they haven't had a huge number of humans historically, and they're a hotspot now because there is something endangering those habitats. So you can see the map there of what's considered biodiversity hotspots right now. We'll be looking a little bit more into this in our class. This is looking at, there's also biodiversity in the oceans. So looking at the number of species worldwide, again, the tropical areas are going to have more species. However, fish are often more abundant and more in the more productive oceans, which are the colder oceans. But again, we look at our tropical areas as the oceans also have more biodiversity as far as different kinds of species than the non-tropical areas. This is a little graphic that just shows, this is only over a 30-year time period, but you can kind of see that there's just a loss overall of species over time. So as it goes from, you can see the date in the upper right corner, or that would be upper left corner. Okay, so just a little graphic for you there. Moving along, so let's get to like, okay, so what do we do about it? We know that species are in trouble. What are all the things we can do to help protect the species? There's two major philosophies. One is an ecosystem approach, meaning let's protect the ecosystem like a biodiversity hotspot. Let's just protect the whole area. And then by virtue of that, we will protect all the species in that area. So it focuses on protecting enough land to protect the ecological integrity and provide habitat for everything in there that might be endangered. The other approach, which is what we take in this country, is a species approach. So it's based on identifying and protecting the endangered species, which of course includes protecting their habitat. So it's kind of, one starts with the habitat and protects the species. The other one starts with the species and ends up protecting the habitat. So in this one, you really are focused. What do we need to do to protect this particular species, which habitat we need to protect, et cetera. Both of these approaches have their advantages. Most people think that you really need a combination of both to protect species. So there's a few international laws. In 1975, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, signed by a whole lot of countries, and it regulated things like the ban on ivory trade. And so, so that hopefully we can reduce things like poaching, et cetera. In 1992, there was also the Convention on Biological Diversity, and that was ratified by 191 countries, but not the US. And it focuses more on ecosystems. And part of the reason I think the US was not part of that is that we actually have one of our stronger environmental laws out there is our Endangered Species Act. So world protected areas. So if you look at percentages of land protected out there, very little no data, but you can kind of see the legend down in the lower left corner about how much is protected in these areas. And you can see it really varies, you know, upwards, the yellow countries are like up to 73% protected or 72% protected. So it varies by area. Okay, so the good news is we have over time, the bad news is over on the left, some of these other endangered species, which I kind of sprinkled again throughout this lecture. But over time, we have actually been protecting more and more land. Okay, so if you look at the upper right, you can see various continents as far as the land that we're protecting, number of protected areas. Again, looking at, you know, over time, we've realized the importance of protecting our species. And so we're doing something about it. Really, when you consider a lot of environmental things, think that it started in the 70s and it's gone on since then. So when you look at the United States, we have wilderness areas, and we have a lot. We're so lucky, we have a lot in the state of Washington. About 4% of the US land is protected. 3/4 of that though is in Alaska. So about 1.8% of land is in the lower 48 is protected. And over time, these, we've had more and more national monuments, national forests, et cetera, set aside. So there's 413 wilderness areas in the lower 48, but only 4 are larger than 4,000 square kilometers, which is the recommended size for the best protection. However, that's like a really huge amount of land. So just to kind of give you a sense for that, how big is 400 square kilometers? It's like the Olympic Mountains. So yes, we have set aside the Olympic Mountains, and like Yellowstone might approach that size. North Cascades is really large, but for most states, like, to set aside that amount of land to protect is just really huge. So most of our wilderness areas are much smaller than that. And it doesn't mean that they're not protecting species. It's just not considered like the most ideal you can have. So how do we solve some of these other problems? So there was the habitat fragmentation problem we talked about in the last lecture is the number one cause, the habitat loss and fragmentation, number one cause of species extinction. Interstates can cause, major fragmentation because, if you're an elk or something trying to cross a highway, it's not going to be good for either you or the cars on the elk or the cars on the highway. So one of the things they're starting to do is build these wildlife corridors. And we'll see a little video in class on the one that they've built across I-90. And there's actually a few, both over and under I-90 and there's actually new video out now that it's open to show that the species have actually found it and they're using it. So this is just a really cool idea. It was expensive though, 6.2 million to build that one you see there in the picture. That was before it was finished. I think it just is finished now, but it's been open for just a little bit of time. So again, if we want to protect species, we have to be willing to put aside the money and the resources to do that. So what about that Endangered Species Act then? 1973, whenever you think environmental laws, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, it's always the 70s. All right, so it's regulated, requires listing and protecting of endangered and threatened species. There are 2 government agencies involved, which you should know about, the National Marine Fisheries Service and for marine species, and then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Species for all the other species. And if you look at the counties here, and again, this is a little bit of a bias as to where the species still are that need protecting. Again, the East Coast had more species historically, but probably wiped out long before the 70s, before we started thinking about it. So the West Coast of the United States, where there's still a lot of empty areas, I showed you the population map in the last lecture. And down in Florida, that is a lot to do with the Everglades, which is a huge wild wetland, probably one of the largest wetlands in the world. So as far as the counties where there are species endangered, don't look at these states that are in red as being really bad to their species. Look at them as areas where they're like biodiversity hotspots. We still have the species there to save. And so when we find that they become endangered, we can put them on the list. So this is just over time, comparing 2005 to 2019 in categories of animals. And one of the things to notice in one of those earlier slides too is just how, I didn't really point it out then, but just how many plants are, we usually think of like the animals about going extinct, but there's an awful lot of plants too, which is also not reflected in this picture either. But realize besides all the animals, reptiles, birds, etc., there are a lot of plants that are on the endangered species list. Okay, so I wanted to show you this, and you don't need to know about the spotted owl in particular, but what does it take if you actually want to protect a species? The spotted owl is endangered. There's barred owls, which are invasive. They encroach on their habitat. They like old growth forest, and we've gotten rid of most of those in our state. So what does it take? This is a map of all the nesting pairs and all the different types of land on which those nesting pairs exist. Think about the work. I mean, look at all the different colors, look at all the dots. Think about the work just to protect the spotted owl. So you can imagine that it takes a lot to try to save a species. So this is types of species. Oh, this is the plant one. So I'm glad I didn't pass it up before, but look at the vascular plants is actually that darkish color where you see an awful lot. And this is up through the year 2015. And the other colors, you can pause this as if you need to. You might want to look at it in case I ask a question on it, but just realize that there's endangered species across both the animal and plant kingdoms. Okay, so how many successes have there been? And this is one of the complaints with the Endangered Species Act is when a species goes on, it very often doesn't come back off again. We've taken very few species off the list over the years. So we have a lot of species currently listed, We've got 39 that have recovered and been able to come off the list. 11 went extinct despite our best efforts. And then 19 species that were delisted, and I don't know all the story behind those. All right, so one of the success stories, the bald eagle. So when I was a kid in the 70s, we were told, so like way down over here, we were told that our national symbol was going to go extinct. And it was very sad. Like, what do you mean? That's like our national symbol. And now, I mean, it's amazing. I see bald eagles all the time. They have really recovered. And I think when you think about the reasons why, they were getting hunted to extinction. There was pollutants like DDT that we were using as pesticides that then went up the food chain, biomagnified. We've banned a lot of those. But I really think a lot of the reason was that, you know, people stopped hunting eagles when we realized how much in danger they were, because nobody wanted our national symbol to go extinct. I also think the advantage that eagles had over, say, something like the condor is that eagles are a lot more adaptable. They're living on Mercer Island with you. They live at Green Lake in the middle of Seattle. They live here in West Seattle. So eagles have been able to adapt to humans, versus other species like the Californian condor is really fussy and will not live around humans. And the other weakness you could say with the law is that there shouldn't really be a partisan thing. If the law is a law, and the Endangered Species Act, that you're supposed to qualify species based on biological evidence alone, so basically scientists should be making those decisions. And yet we do see a real difference between often in between administrations. And I couldn't actually find a current graph to include the Trump administration on this. But it does seem like there is an effect of administrations on that, whether they're friendly to listing species or hostile to it. When they're friendly to it, you got to be careful. There's a lot of other competing interests, organizations that might be fighting for their pet species to get listed. And often these things get tied up in lawsuits too. So what are the issues with it? So a conflict between economic interests and ecological interests. So people saying, what, you're going to like keep me from like, you know, cutting down these trees because I don't want to build my dream house on this property I bought, but there's spotted owls here, or even more, a company who has interest, who owns a forest, and then all of a sudden an endangered species is found there, and now all of a sudden you're telling them that they can't cut the forest down. There goes their investment. So it's also, the original was, remember, it's supposed to be on scientific evidence alone, and no economic factors are considered there. We have a hanging parenthesis. And so then the other thing is that as we add more and more species and almost none of them come off, think about that spotted owl picture I showed you. Imagine all the money it's taking now, all the resources it's taking to protect all of these species. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing it. I'm just saying these have been arguments that have been put up as to what are some of the issues and why there's a lot of fighting going over the Endangered Species Act. And then finally, there's just been so many lawsuits, both people fighting to get their particular favorite species listed, government fighting to keep some of these from going on. And so there's been a lot of political interest in those on both sides, you know, from the people who want to delist species and then people who want to list more species, that there's been a lot of time and money tied up in lawsuits, which is just kind of sad. So, and then if you look at the bottom picture, just the funding for what we need and, you know, versus like how much money we're putting at it, more and more species get added, but the money to take care of them has not increased proportionately. All right, and then just this last year, a year ago, the Department of Interior announced changes that include, so they're changing the law, and this is really the first time it's really been weakened in the history since it was first passed in the early 70s, that you must have an economic impact statement. You think a lot of times when you're going to build, say, a new shopping center, you have to have an EIS, environmental impact statement. Now they're basically saying before you can list a species, you need an economic impact statement when considering. So no longer is it going to be just on biology alone or science alone. It made it easier to remove species from the list. And then threatened species will no longer receive the same protections. Remember, the idea is you get them when they're threatened so that they don't become endangered, because once they become endangered, they're a lot harder to save. And then designation of critical habitat will focus on areas already occupied by endangered species. So that's more the ecosystem approach, but they're not going to, like, say, not going to be as favorable to opening up new areas for protection. And then not going to allow climate change as part of this whole equation, which is just sad. But, you know, anyway, that's where we're at right now. Final slide, just remember, we have a lot. You should want to always protect biodiversity. And this is just I Googled like nature lover, and these were the pictures that came up. So I hope you enjoyed part 2, and we'll see you guys in class.